This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, To Each His Own Agenda by Matt Gupta.
Chapter 62. The Villain. The army attacking the city walls was massive. It filled the 10-mile stretch of land. The cavalry forces arrayed against them stretched along the entire villum. The lines were long enough to outflank them, but they weren't particularly thick. The horsemen were in an arrowhead formation, but unlike most formations, the arrowhead faced away from the enemy lines, so the cavalry on the flanks would hit the army first. The center lines had the best impact, as the most veteran and elite units were being led by Turgon. The front lines of Julius's army were crushed in an instant. The night rose up in screams of both man and beast, along with the clash of steel. But Falthor had fallen into Julius's trap, realizing it too late. Falthor was at the back of the center lines, and only when the forces had clashed and every horseman was committed, the villum wall came alive with firelight. Flaming arrows replaced the stars and crashed into the cavalry lines. At the time, he had the largest archery force in the world, but these arrows dwarfed his own. The cavalry collapsed under their weight. Falthor commanded the cavalry fall back, to be replaced with his own legionary infantry. He was cautious now, but the freedmen stood no chance against his men, either way. The dead on Julius's side littered the battlefield far more than the dead of the cavalry. The infantry closed the gap quickly and then stopped just short of the battle lines. They formed a shield wall, balancing their swords on the tips of their immense rectangular shields. The next formations of freedmen threw themselves against the infantry. His archer formations took up positions behind the melee troops. Falthor rode hard to the flanks, chased objectively by Cameron and his citadel guards. Falthor ordered his archers on the flanks to switch their targets to the forces on the wall. With a discipline far beyond their rank, the archers switched their targets mid-draw and opened fire straight at the wall. The elves on the wall realized the danger and opened fire against the ranger battalions. An arrow came rushing at Falthor, but Cameron's spear flashed in front of him, and the arrow embedded itself in the metal shaft. "How the fuck did you manage without me?" Cameron shouted, grabbing his shield from his horse and raising it to cover himself and Falthor. Falthor did nothing to acknowledge him, aside from a grimace in his cheek. Once the volley had finished, he pushed Cameron's shield aside and rushed over to the other side of the force to take command of the archers there. Durian, along with 6 of his elves and 3 wardens of the Fountain Court, took a long look at the battle occurring in the villum. 1 hour, a warden noted. Durian nodded as the elves moved aside the iron grating that Gylorn and the rangers had used to get into the city. Marius was waiting for them in the city, along with another 10 of his marines, who resembled pirate scum more than defenders of the kingdom. Once they were all through, they made their way through the streets. All the attention was on the front gate, but there were queues of men massing in the outer plaza to get ready for battle. They made slow progress, having to wait for a patrol to pass or to bypass an entire group of people. The men could blend with the crowd, but the wardens and the elves had no such luxury, with their vividly unique armor and costume. Finally, they made it to the first gate. It was open and the men were in no mood to waylay them or even notice them. But when they were inside, a drill sergeant stepped in front of Marius. "The battle is that way," he barked, pushing Marius with a single hand. "Yes, it is," Marius smirked. The drill sergeant made to push him again, but Marius pulled him towards him and struck him in the throat. The drill sergeant fell back, winded but still standing. He pulled out his sword and made to lunge at Marius, but a throwing knife ended up in his chest. Jurian followed his throwing knife with a downward slash of his long, curved blade, cutting the man from shoulder to waist. "Was that necessary?" a warden complained. His words indicated anger, but his tone did not. "Does it matter?" Marius calmly said, looking around to see if they were noticed. "He's dead. Let's go. It's only a matter of time before someone finds the body." They moved from the murder scene to the bottom of the stairs to the citadel. None of them showed any signs of wanting to hide the body. It took them a while to find the entrance to the prison. The idea of the prison was that it was completely out of reach of anyone, even the leaders of the city. There was an entrance inside the citadel itself, as the Black Keep was made for political prisoners and high-level enemies of state, not the garden variety thieves and scoundrels. Finally, they found the loose stone that Hypatia had told them about, and Marius pulled it out. From there, they could use their swords and axes to shimmy the other stones out. The walled-in arch broke away from them in a cloud of dust and mouldy air. They entered the keep. Marius lit a torch using a bone and broken piece of cloth, but the elves could see in the dark much better than the men. They dashed along, keen to not waste time. The Black Keep was secure by reputation. Trusting in its maze-like layout and total darkness, there were few guards. Marius was keeping track of where they were going by dripping a thick black liquid on the sand-covered floor. He would have preferred string, but the amount needed to navigate the keep would have required a tremendous amount, miles and miles of it. They continued in a straight line in the prison, ignoring the turns and other paths, trusting in their naval ability to know when they were deviating from their direction. Even with this, however, they encountered dead ends and had to double back. As they moved through the keep, the darkness seemed to enclose them, and even the elves had to slow to see where they were going. Every scuffle of rats or drip of damp echoed around them as loud as a battle cry. But soon they found a stairway, which they took up. The cells in the Black Keep above them were filled. The prisoners that Alistair had placed on this level were the low-level soldiers who had been roughly taken from their lines and held little importance to Alistair aside from their sheer bulk. Those who were capable were attracted to the firelight and reached through the bars, begging in broken voices to be set free. Their pleas fell on deaf ears for Marius and Jurian. These were not allies or men who could be swayed to their way. These were men who had fought for Egnatius, or whose only loyalty was money. Though they had plenty of money to pay for such loyalty, it was hardly worth it. Julius and Mistnir had grappled with the idea of freeing these men for their own cause, but Mistnir had won him over by advising him that mercenaries were not to be trusted, as money always ran scarce in times of need. The men who had actually been conscribed to fight, the men of the kingdom, had been placed in the barracks prisons, killed or pardoned en masse by Alistair. These men were here to die away from the eyes of the public. They found the next stairway upwards. The prison was exactly the same as it was below, but Marius was now lost. He took several wrong turns, having to be corrected by Jurian. But even Jurian made mistakes in some areas. The liquid was able to get them back on track. It worked until they reached the next level up. This was where the men of note were being kept. These men had fared much worse than the soldiers, as many of them were used to a life of luxury, and many of them had died already in captivity. Alistair, or rather his aides, had visited them, offering them terms of surrendering their houses' riches, but the men who had remained in prison were the men unwilling to surrender and were condemned to a slow death. They passed them with little incident, but the men along the last set of cells, the men who had been there the shortest time, screamed out for freedom. This level had guards though, and in the keep they were attracted by the noise and light. They rushed at the elves and men, but their black armor glistened with the metal of their keys, and the clank of the gold that they carried with them meant that Marius's party knew they were coming before they got close. The fighting was brief, but bloody. 4 of Marius's men were slain, and Marius's wounds began to bleed again. The 3 wardens effortlessly took out the remaining guards, and the elves didn't even need to unsheath their swords and simply resorted to their throwing knives, throwing with pinpoint accuracy into the deep dark. They carried on, using the bodies as markers where the liquid was running dry. The elves took the heads of the guards and used them to drip blood down onto the floor. Finally, another staircase later, they were on the deserted floor that held the Lord Warden, or at least the one that Hypatia had told them to find him on. This level was just below the citadel itself, and only the few and most special of all prisoners were kept here. Black Plank was attracted by the noise of battle below, but his stiff limbs precluded him from making the journey down the stairs. "Who are you?" he stammered, standing 7 paces from the top of the stairs. "Stand aside, cripple," Durian scowled, in a deadly serious tone, placing a hand on his sword. "No need for that," Marius smiled in the dark, gathering his strength and standing straight. "We are men of the Lord Julius. Who are you?" Black Plank never took his dark eyes off of Durian's sword. "Warden of the Black," he grunted, twitching. "What do you want?" "To visit a friend," Marius said cheerfully. "Do you know where he is?" "You're not welcome," Black Plank grumbled, drool falling from his mouth. "Aren't we?" Marius asked, painfully pulling out a plump bag of coins. He was grateful for the loss of its weight from his belt. The clink of gold and silver caught Black Plank's attention. Marius smiled and tossed the bag from one hand to the other. "Are we welcome now?" Black Plank nodded, as much as he could. "Take us to our friend." "No friends," Black Plank's jaw contorted slightly. "Only rats." "We are all rats in the dark," Marius agreed, and tossed up the bag and then caught it. Negotiation was over. "Take us to the Warden Rat." "Enough of this," Durian snapped. He pushed Marius aside with one hand. "Kill him and be done." "Stay your blade," the Fountain Warden urged loudly. "I would see us out of this darkness quickly. He can help us escape through the citadel." "And find ourselves amidst their blades." "The blades are at the city front," Marius grunted. The pain and the lack of progress started to irritate him. "Take us to the Lord Warden Commander, and you shall have your payment." Black Plank studied him for a moment and then limped away. Once he was a few steps away, he waved an arm in a strange arc. "Come," he called, sounding strangely bird-like. His pace was slow, but so was theirs, as Marius had to rely on the warden carrying him to move. Unlike the floors below them, this part was a true labyrinth. Even Durian had to realize that they needed Black Plank to guide them, or else they would be lost forever in the darkness. They had to stop once, as one of the torches was consumed by the darkness, and they had to light another. Black Plank hadn't stopped. He knew the way without having to see. After nearly 10 minutes of terrible darkness, and crossing an untold number of corners and turns, they finally found Black Plank standing outside a cell. They looked inside, but even with the torches pressed right up against the bars, they couldn't see the man inside, only his silhouette. "Key?" The warden turned to their guide. Black Plank pulled out his keys and opened the door. Durian pushed him aside and entered, shining the torch on the man nearly crucified to the wall. The Lord Warden was so weak, he couldn't lift his head. Lord Warden, one of the wardens, knelt down by the figure. He propped his head up, pulled out his water skin, and put it to his lord's mouth. The Lord Warden drank eagerly, half emptying the skin. He coughed and spluttered, water dripping from his mouth and onto his soiled prison cloths. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, a desperate sorrow to his voice. He suddenly groaned in pain. The sudden rush of drink had caused a severe cramp in his body. "Rescuing you," the warden replied, impassively. Jurian had pulled out his blade and struck the cuffs from the Lord Warden's hands. He fell to the floor and was caught by the warden. "I gave you orders," the Lord Warden coughed. "Leave this place. Join Julius and protect the kingdom." "We have," the warden reassured him. "That path has led us here. Julius has Aquila's and Mystnir's army, as well as the Elven army out of Corinthos. He seeks to put an end to the war before it consumes us all." "We need to find Egnatius," Marius grunted. He made to turn to Black Plank, but the Lord Warden answered, "He is not here. Alistair does not have him." "Then all is lost. If we cannot control Egnatius, he will be free to wage war on Alistair's new world." "Egnatius is broken," the Lord Warden coughed. "He cannot wage a war on Alistair. He is not the man he once was. But the forces of his allies can still spell trouble for any that are not their own. He must be found and made to surrender if we can stop a civil war." "We cannot do anything of that now," Jurian said, sternly but wisely. "We must leave now, or we will be forever trapped here." "He's too weak to move." The warden shook his head as the Lord Warden tried to stand. "Eat," Jurian barked, simply tossing him some kind of chopped mushroom. The Lord Warden ate it hurriedly, apparently too quickly, as he choked slightly. The warden looked concerned. "That will do," the Lord Warden nodded, standing slightly more confidently than before. His joints let out terrible cracks as he stretched them. Marius was in agreement. "Show us the way out," he said to Black Plank. Black Plank grimaced, or perhaps that was his way of smiling. He led them along the corridor and plunged into the darkness again. After a lifetime of terrible void where every noise was magnified to terrible stabs within their heads, they arrived at the citadel entrance to the dungeon. Marius pulled out his money bag again, but eager to leave, he didn't count out the money and simply threw the whole bag to the ugly man. They left the darkness of the dungeon into a side corridor of stone and rock that tilted upwards. It was lit with torches on the walls, so they discarded their handheld ones. Marius had wondered why the prison was set against the palace. Surely the risk of murderers near the government outweighed the need to hide them away securely. His doubts had been set aside when he realized how far they had to travel to get to the palace itself. With all of the doors and staircases they had to traverse, they may as well have entered a new district. Finally, they entered the lush green of the fountain court. The sudden rush of breathable air smashed into them, so much so that Marius fell to the ground. The moon was reflected off of the citadel itself and was lighting up the whole garden. Marius had been wrong, however. The garden was guarded, and their presence in the court was immediately recognized. The Knights of Seaward rounded on them instantly. "Gentlemen," Marius grimaced, stepping forward, "you wouldn't happen to know where I can find some bandages by any chance, would you?" The knights were not amused and drew their swords. The Lord Warden stepped out, however, and drew Marius's sword from his scabbard. His 3 wardens stood by him. For a moment, nothing happened. But then the Lord Warden stamped his foot and waved his sword around, as if he was casting a spell with it. The fight started. each of the wardens were fighting 3 to 4 men each, but they were clearly the superior men. Durian and his elves waited for the fight to pause before each of them launched a volley of throwing knives at the knights. Several fell and the rest wavered, but the wardens did not make a move, waiting for them to attack. Marius's marines stayed out of the fight, but Durian's elves charged in, and the knights could do nothing to fight them. Before long, the garden was red with blood. The warden commander staggered slightly after slapping his blade across a knight's face. His wounds and his weakness took over. Several of the marines rushed to help him, slinging him between them. "We need to go," one of the wardens said, in an unnaturally hurried tone. "Our wounded will not survive much longer." "I have no plans to die today," Marius groaned. "Neither did they," Durian grunted, pulling his sword out from a man's abdomen. "Come." He made no indication that he would wait for the wounded and took his elves down the stairs. The battle in the villum had continued into a stalemate. The elves on the walls had retreated from the infantry that Pilimor had sent in without a fight. With the arrival of fresh legions, the forces for Julius were fighting on every front, though they were holding their ground. Mistnir's forces had joined the fight as well, reinforcing the broken lines of the freedmen, and to make matters worse for Felthor's army, the Fountain Legion started to make the march forward, using their distinctive horn blast to indicate their presence. Many of the forces wavered and hesitated to enter the battle, having seen firsthand what these same men had done. Even Turgon found himself hesitant. Their courage was completely broken, however, when the artillery on the wall fired without the leave of any orders, 1 shot per catapult. The great siege engines roared to life, and the massive projectiles flew through the air and crashed into the battle lines of both armies. The artillery needed work, and many of the trebuchets collapsed under their own weight, but it was enough to break apart Felthor's army. Marius and 2 of his marines exited through the same way that the others had. Now accompanied by the Lord Warden, they waited for the elves to rejoin them from the city walls. Only 4, including Durian, joined them. None of the marines who had gone with them had returned. The elves were bloodied and cleaved. 1 elf was badly wounded, but was too proud to ask for help. "Impressive," the Lord Warden smiled painfully, admiring their handiwork. "I had no idea that elves were siegecrafters." "There is much you do not know," Durian said, not acknowledging the Lord Warden any better than Marius. They exited the grating and found their horses, who were screaming against the noise of the battle, but still remained tied to the post. They mounted up. The spare horses were let loose to bolt. If they survived, they would return to camp when the adrenaline wore out. They followed the edge of the villum wall, making sure to stay away from the battle. But where the wall began to circle back, they found this much more difficult, unable to avoid hitting the flanks of the battlefield. These were their own men, but none of them had been told of their arrival, and some turned to face them, seeing only men charging towards them. Fortunately for them, a charging horseman was quite terrifying to a lone soldier, so none broke formation to intercept them. When the formations came to such a point where they could no longer avoid this, the men slowed down to appear less threatening. The men at the back were the elves, who had fallen back from the wall, and they recognized their commander in his distinctive silver armor. The elves parted with extreme discipline, letting the riders traverse their lines and then snapping back to their positions as if nothing had happened. On the other side of the wall, Julius waited upon his horse with his other commanders. The Swan was commanding the forces in the villum. "Where is Egnatius?" Mistnir demanded, panting hard, despite having been standing alongside Julius. "Alistair doesn't have him," informed him. He has few prisoners, only mercenaries. If Egnatius lies within the walls, he is likely dead." Julius let out a roar of rage that showed his youth, but he regained his composure almost immediately. "Pull our forces back. Let us leave this place. See them to the healers," he added to a knight by his side. The horns of retreat sounded along the villum. The Fountain Legion had been sent in to hold the enemy lines while the others retreated. It took a while before the forces began moving back. Julius stayed by the gate, watching his men leave the villum 6 at a time. He could see the casualties that his forces had suffered and was able to sum up their losses simply by the men not present. "I've just sent 6,000 men to their deaths and have nothing to show for it." "Many more will die before this is done," Hypatia said, relentlessly. "Do not let them see you weep. The men knew their risks. All we can do is honor their sacrifice." Julius nodded. "I swear that I will build a wall with the names of the fallen in the city of Corinthos. If the Father will allow me to return, in Seaward too."